very briefly, perhaps, indeed, Dr. Peyman Vahabzadeh, who is, I think, probably well known to all of us. Peyman has been with us in the department for about 15 years, I think. And we're here today to celebrate the release of his new book, Violence and Nonviolence. This is, I believe, Peyman's 6th book in English. And he's the author of many other publications in both English and in Persian. With that, I will turn it over to Peyman. He's going to talk to us a little bit about the book.
And thank you all of you for being here. I take comfort in knowing that you're here because of the free food. Not for the book or me. That's always very reassuring. I love that. Thank you especially to Steve, who really insisted on this despite my reluctance. If you know me personally, you know that I don't like to appear in public very much, and somehow my job forces me to do this. So I published this book published by the University of Toronto Press. It's a result of very long meditations on the subject, and my sort of intellectual resistance to binarisms that I noticed, especially in the West, since I've been living in Canada for 30 years, where violence and nonviolence are regarded as pure moments, as pure modes of action. And the more I look at the world in which we live, I realize that this is actually not the case. We are linked to violence in every imaginable way, and probably the most basic form of violence we are engaged with is in the form of the food that we consume, and how much violence is in that food that we consume. So all of these thoughts basically made me write this book, which started in 2013 and ended in 2016, the first draft. And while I was writing this book for 3 years, I was also a CSPT director, so I was teaching the CSPT core course. And I was also holding 3 directed readings courses. And all of these kind of appear in my work, the dialogues and questions and criticisms that I received in those settings. Especially important for this book was the 2014 to 16, when there were police brutality in the United States and sort of African American uprisings, especially in the case of Ferguson, Missouri, that had a really deep impact in the way I conceptualize this work. Usually the way we write a book is basically that we have a thesis, we start developing it, but I wrote the book without having any thesis. I just had an idea, and I started writing, and the more I wrote and the more I thought, it changed and changed and changed until it got its present shape. So it wasn't really a book that was thought in advance and then implemented in the act of writing. No, the act of writing was actually for me the act of thinking at the same time. So when we look at the American case of police brutality against African Americans, there was especially this article by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and where he talked about the call of the authorities and the police and the mayor of Ferguson for nonviolence. And this is where he got the notion of nonviolence as compliance. And that was the sort of watershed moment for me, that nonviolence in much of the world has become basically an excuse for reformist, non-structural changes, right, that don't change the nature of violence, that is institutional. So my approach here is, of course, phenomenological. I launched a conceptual phenomenology between the conceptual phenomenology of the distinction or opposition of violence and nonviolence. It is also informed by my radical phenomenology or temporal phenomenology, which is about a critique of the West as a history of metaphysics, and with metaphysics come violence, in the forms that we witness it everywhere, but also in epistemological forms, in a mode of thinking that is imposed on us and makes us act in certain ways under certain epochs, but regard those acts as matter of fact. So a phenomenology basically brings the matter of fact as a problem, right? And tries to show how this matter of fact is actually a hegemonic construct. So the book's point of departure are two things. The first is a hypothesis, and this hypothesis, I call it the ontological primacy of violence, which means that all civilizations are based on violence, are built on violence in various forms. Now, this is a hypothesis, a phenomenological hypothesis. This is not a hypothesis to be tested, right, in the positivist fashion, right? This is a hypothesis that actually unleashes the master code for interpreting the events of an era, right? This is how we regard hypotheses, right, in phenomenology. And then the second one is a thesis, actually, one of the theses of the book, which holds that human action is the source of both violence and non-violence, precisely because human action opens up a course of future events of whose consequences we are not aware, we cannot be aware. That thesis actually is not mine, it's from Hannah Arendt. So there's a certain blindness, if you like, by all of us into the consequences of our action. So the book is actually it's about close reading for its bulk, really, of both advocates of revolutionary violence and non-violence. So, you know, the thinkers and theorists and you know, philosophers that I read in this book very closely include Sorel, Fanon, Benjamin, Sharp, Galton, Tolstoy, Thoreau, Butler, Gandhi, and with all of these, there are engagements from my favorite philosopher, Rainer Schurman, of course, whose work informs everything I write, but also Derrida, Vatimo, Laclau, and especially Hannah Arendt, whose work is like spreads, whose influence spreads all over the book. So the outcome of the book is, I'll come back to this, but the outcome of the book is the argument that the distinction between violence and non-violence, while matter of fact, while understood, you know, commonly by both layperson and academic, it actually is a construct that is both epistemological and hegemonic. And as such, upon close examination, it becomes unsustainable. And this is actually the gift of phenomenology. The second sort of most important point of departure of the book is probing the term nonviolence in a phenomenological fashion. In phenomenology, as you know, we take words as revealing a state of being. So I kind of looked into nonviolence in as much as I could, and realized that in almost all European languages, but also in some non-European languages, I didn't do a survey of languages, of course, the word nonviolence is a privative term. It's a negative term. It's a radically negative term. And then I realized that every time someone advocates nonviolence, tries to attach this negative term into some positive value. For example, Galton attaches or redefines nonviolence as peace or social justice, Tolstoy, love, and Gandhi, truth, right? So everyone who is dealing with nonviolence tries to give a positivist sort of, positively ascertainable sort of substance, right? But nonviolence defies that substance, right? And that's what I argue. This kind of thinking I called algorithmic truisms in the book. And then I realized that there is another term that's actually radically negative, and that's liberation. Once again, this is Arendt. Liberation is also a negative term. It doesn't have any substance. You liberate yourself from oppression, but it doesn't really mean that what comes after liberation or emancipation is necessarily non-oppressive, right? So that's again another term. So these two terms, I realize, have some kind of a family resemblance with one another: nonviolence and liberation, right? So this is the hint, so to speak, that I develop at the end of the book about a possibility of a nonviolent future. So the book basically entails 5 propositions. I go through these propositions, and then the final proposition of the book, and then maybe, just because it's a book launch, I read a passage from the book that you sort of see, the way I, make my arguments. So the first proposition is to offer a tripartite phenomenology of violence. So I realized that the humanist critique of violence is actually very limited. It actually measures violence against humans as violent and excludes all non-humans. So we can be perfect humanists defending human rights and condemning violence against humans and abuse and violent nature, sentient beings, destroy, natural habitat and all that. So we exclude that precisely because if we factor in non-humans into our understanding of violence, then that disturbs this sort of nice sort of opposition of violence versus non-violence. So I came up with this tripartite phenomenology: structural violence, such as patriarchy; institutional violence, such as state, right? And hubristic violence, the violence of person against person. These 3 modes of violence allow me to have this really very broad understanding of violence rather than narrow it down to violence against human beings. The second proposition is to understand what violence does to us, right? And that's on chapter 2, basically. The second proposition is about deworlding, reworlding, and phenomenal violence. In phenomenology, we believe that there is no human that lives outside of a world, or Welt in German. And a world is basically a set of human relations with one another and through one another with the world. So what violence does, it deworlds me. It robs me out of my world, right, as is best shown in the history of colonialism, right? And if you want to really see that, really the naked moment of deworlding, you should really read Bartolomé de las Casas' A Short History of the Destruction of the Indies. That's the book I teach every term in my colonialism class, and we open the class with that to see the sheer violence of colonialism, right? And so rewarding is forcing the deworlded subject into a new world. So you were free indigenous people up to this point, and then suddenly, because of the Spanish conquest, you're pushed into slave labor or whatever. But it's an imposed world, right? And then that brings me into more radical thinking about this process that I call phenomenal violence, or violence of life against life, right? So I deprive myself of taking a moral stance in the colonial concept, and when I do that, I understand that this is basically a certain civilization's mode of life being imposed on another civilization's mode of life, right? But both of these, if you don't moralize the question for the moment, are living civilizations, right? So this brings me to the question of violence of life against life, which I'm going to actually explore further in the subsequent volume of this book, which actually is about suffering, care, love, and things like that. All these things that we conflate either with violence or non-violence, and kind of probe all these things, these concepts or notions. The third proposition is that violence and non-violence are intimately braided concepts. They cannot be separate from one another. No human action is at any time non-violent or violent. That includes above all love, right, which can be very abusive and non-violent. And so there is no pure moment of violence or non-violence. And the third proposition leads me to discover in my reading of those authors that I talked about, the way when they try to assert either revolutionary violence or nonviolence as a means of emancipation, they actually are calling on the opposite term at the same time. So, for example, in Fanon, who clearly everyone knows advocates violence against the colonizer, right? In a close reading, you will see that Fanon actually in advocating violence is inviting nonviolent, rewarding, and the sort of what he calls the creation of a new man, right? And that's typical of everyone who talks about violence or nonviolence, or advocates nonviolence, revolutionary violence and nonviolence. The fourth proposition is that nonviolence is the excess of violence, and that actually came through observing Ferguson, where the media and the authorities talked about excessive force of the police, right? And then I was writing this book at the same time, and then I kind of came up with the idea that if force is up to a certain point legitimate, right, then excessive force means that the force has exceeded its institutional mandates, right? And when the force shows itself outside of its own institutional mandates or rationale, right, that which makes it acceptable, then it's no longer acceptable, right? And it is in that moment when the violence reveals itself out of its hegemonic construct and becomes naked violence that actually the possibility of nonviolence is born, right? It's because we understand the logic of violence, and that logic has been exposed to us. We no longer adhere to it in a sort of hegemonic way. The fifth proposition, of course, and the last proposition before the last, is that all theories of violence and nonviolence deploy an algorithmic equivalence. In other words, they take violence and attach it to something they can actually analyze. Like I said, nonviolence is attached to peace, for example, right? Or to moral or ethical considerations, and so on and so forth, right? So, that's good on time. So, the book concludes with this proposition that instead of taking violence and nonviolence as opposites, we have to begin to think about them as concentric. And this is the concept that I borrowed, actually, being married to a mathematician from my wife, right? And in concentric shapes, the rule that sort of governs basically the central shape also governs the peripheral shape, right? So it's the same law applies to both violence and nonviolence. And here, I'll read a passage from the book where I explain this very moment. Nonviolence follows the logic of violence, always. It cannot have it never has a existence on its own. So there is a conceptual and ontological dependency of nonviolence on violence, right? Like I've always said in my classes, in a just world, you don't have a word for justice. In a nonviolent world, you don't have a word for violence, right? So when we are actually engaging with these things, it means that we are experiencing violence and injustice and so on and so forth. So if violence and nonviolence are concentric ontologically, then that leaves me to the possibility of a nonviolent future in which the word nonviolence will no longer exist. And I coin a few new terms to show the way we can begin thinking of a nonviolent future, but the requirement for that is a civilizational shift. In other words, this civilization has no capacity, in my judgment, to reform itself and move towards a nonviolent arrangement or rearrangement of phenomena, humans, non-humans, structures, institutions, and so on and so forth. So, and in that, of course, I'm inspired by Fanon, that you really need a completely new world, right? the way we reach it, we discussed it a little bit, especially through the work of Walter Benjamin, where he says, where he tells this story that Kafka told, actually, that the rabbi once said that the Messiah will come and change the world by making small adjustments, right? What that small adjustment is to be seen, right? So let me just read a passage where I engage with Tolstoy, and those of you who know me, you know that I come from a literature background, and I went to school as a mature student to study literature, and I ended up in sociology, right? So wrong turns in life sometimes land you in not so bad places, right? But my love for literature and poetry, everyone knows that. Still to this day, I read every day, almost every day, literature, poetry, and so on and so forth. So Tolstoy has a book that has been published in many different ways, where he actually, after having written masterpieces of literature, right, Anna Karenina, War and Peace, he actually started writing folk fables, right? And these are really like the best moments in Tolstoy, where the ethical Tolstoy emerges, right? So, I narrate two stories and explore the philosophical implications of those stories for my work. And I just read my summary of the second story and skip through a lot of analysis and then just my conclusion on that story. And this, I intentionally talk about this, and I want to read this because it's about reconciliation. And reconciliation is what is in public discourse nowadays. Reconciliation that's advocated by the Canadian government and by the university. The reconciliation between Aboriginal, Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people, and so on and so forth. And that has some implications about that. So let me just read very quickly this story, and then some reflections on this story about the way violence and non-violence work. So Tolstoy narrates in the story of a king who, in order to ensure that he would never fail in anything, searches for answers to three questions. How to know the proper moment for every deed. How to know which were the most essential people, and how not to err in deciding which pursuits were of the greatest importance. Dissatisfied with the answers he receives from his advisors and courtiers, he embarks on a journey to anonymously to pay a visit to a hermit renowned for his wisdom who lives simply in a forest. Faced with the hermit's refusal to provide express answers to his three questions, the king stays with him, helping him with the tasks that challenge the hermit's frail skill. A while later, the two notice a man, wounded and soaked with blood, running out of the woods. Under the hermit's guidance, the king attends to the now unconscious stranger's wounds, stopping the bleeding and saving his life. On regaining consciousness, the wounded stranger professes to the king that he had intended to assassinate him to avenge his brother's murder and seizure of his property on the king's orders. His plan failed when his ambush was discovered by the royal guards stationed at the edge of the forest. Wounded, he narrowly escaped capture. Touched by the king's compassion and care, the assassin appeals for forgiveness, which fills the king with the delight of reconciliation with his mortal enemy. The king promises to rectify his injustices. Upon departure, the king puts the three questions to the hermit one last time, only to be reminded by the sage that he had answered his own questions already. Remember that, avers the hermit. There is only one important time, now. And it is important because it is the only time we have dominion over ourselves. And the most important man is he with whom you are, for no one can know whether or not he will ever have dealings with any other man. And the most important pursuit is to do good to him, since it is for that purpose alone that man was sent into this life. On that last point, I should say that Tolstoy has a philosophy that all life is one, right? So he has this kind of cosmological understanding of life, and each one of us lives within that large life that encompasses all. So our lives are actually, our individual lives are not as important as that one life, right? And our individual lives have to contribute to that one life that encompasses all. So I skip a lot of analyses and the structures of the inequalities and inegalitarian relations between the assailant and the king and so on and so forth, right? Just to arrive at this, one last observation, which actually talks to the thesis of the book also. Of the two men forgiving each other, it is the assailant whose forgiveness has the greatest impact on reconciliation, because he forgives the unforgivable, the death of his brother. Although, as Derrida would say, the abyss remains, and the assailant does not receive justice despite his forgiveness. Confiscated property can be restored to its original owner. One can be compensated for material losses. Death is irreversible and cannot be rectified. But in this story, a death becomes the ground, a groundless ground, or an abyss indeed, for surpassing the cycle of violence, a pathway towards supplanting evil through reconciliation or an act of mutual recognition. The condition of possibility of forgiveness is violence, and forgiveness appears on our horizon in the face of that which is unforgivable. Forgiveness is the only act that can transcend evil and violence, not by subduing or supplanting it, but by incorporating it generously, taking possession of the history of violence that is always my own history as well, and thus putting violence out of operation. It must now be clear why I call nonviolence the excess of violence. As with the term excessive force, in violence's unending attempts to violate and dominate by reaching out into ever more domains of action, it generates ever expanding circumferential domains in which it exhausts itself. Structurally, forgiveness exists within these circumferential domains. Forgiving always occurs as a result of experience of violence. Thus understood, forgiveness does not constitute the binary opposite of violence. Hence, to reiterate violence's ontological dependence on violence, nonviolence emerges from the outward excess of violence and exceeds it from violence's expanding circumferences inward. Thus, nonviolence encloses violence within it. Thank you very much for being here.